Welcome to Silicon Bytes. This episode is all about energy, especially the gas supply to Europe. Rumours abound that the EU is considering renewing gas purchases from Russia as part of a Ukrainian peace deal. Where do we even start with this unbelievably misguided, opportunistic, immoral, and strategically brain-dead idea? Dependence on Russian gas is what led Putin to believe he could invade a sovereign European nation in the first place and coerce all the others to just tolerate that. Allegedly, EU officials are discussing the potential resumption of gas purchases via a Russian pipeline as part of a potential settlement of the Russia-Ukraine war. This was reported by the Financial Times on January 30th, citing undisclosed sources. The proposal's advocates, including Hungarian and German officials, well, of course it would, argue the move could give Russia and Europe incentives to maintain a peace deal while stabilizing the continent's energy market, the outlet wrote. And this apparently based on the theory that Moscow was so trustworthy the first time round through the Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk Accords that we should have another go at surrendering our security to the tyrant in the Kremlin. Such logic also assumes that the Russian leadership are economically and politically rational and ignore the clear imperialistic and genocidal motivations behind Putin's war of aggression. This news comes a month after Ukraine halted the transit of Russian gas through its territory to the EU. That was hailed as a historic end of a scheme dating back to Soviet times. 1 month. That's all it took for useful idiots, assets of the Kremlin, and quislings to crawl back to Moscow to seek a good deal on energy, cheap energy. Slovakia and Hungary continue to rely on Russian gas despite the bloc's efforts at diversifying supplies. The decision has sparked protests from some EU members, notably and not surprisingly from Ukraine's chief allies within the EU and officials from some eastern member states. European countries continue to buy Russian liquefied natural gas, LNG, and Turk Stream remains the last operational pipeline connecting Russian gas to the EU. Before the full-scale war, Russian pipeline gas represented roughly 40% of the EU's overall purchases, with Germany being the chief buyer. Fossil fuel exports represent a key portion of Russia's state revenue and help fuel Moscow's all-out war against Ukraine. At the same time, Trump has pinned campaign promises on brokering a peace settlement in Ukraine, but is also seeking to force Europe to purchase more American LNG. He's called for increasing oil production to push down the prices and stifle Russia's revenues. This is a tactic we have advocated on the channel for some time, but the imposition of tariffs on Canada, which is the largest exporter of oil to the US, would seem to illogically undercut his own strategy. To fix the terrible optics of this story, EU officials are denying that there is any connection between resuming Russian gas purchases and peace talks on ending Russia's war. The European Commission aims to eliminate Russian fossil fuels from the European Union's energy market by 2027, but this may be too late to have any impact on the war's outcome. Floating the resumption of pipeline sales from Russia has infuriated some Brussels officials and diplomats from some Eastern European countries, many of whom have spent the last 3 years working to reduce the amount of Russian energy being imported into the bloc. It's madness, one of them said. How stupid could we be to even think about that as an option? Well, I cannot argue with that. President Zelensky said on Wednesday, ending the hot phase of war is critical. Diplomatic solutions are preferable. Fewer casualties, fewer losses. His office, however, did not respond on the topic of resuming Russian gas purchases. It's likely that the dire straits of the EU's heavy industries have increased the need to source cheaper energy. Gas costs in Europe are typically 3 to 4 times higher than in the US. In the end, everybody wants lower energy costs, said a senior EU official. Slovakia, directly linked to the Ukrainian pipeline that halted Russian gas deliveries faces an annual loss of 500 million euros in transit revenues. A potential peace deal between Trump and Russia would almost certainly lead to pressure for talks from Slovakia on resuming Russian gas. There is pressure from the other side too. Russia's largest liquefied natural gas company, Novatek, has approached think tanks in Brussels to lobby against tightening EU sanctions. The European Policy Centre, Bruegel, and the Centre on Regulation in Europe were all approached by Novatek, requesting a meeting with the company's deputy chair, Denis Solovyov. All the think tanks, which influence EU decisions with reports and policy proposals, declined the request, apparently. The European Commission this week proposed limited bans on Russian LNG going to EU ports that are not linked up to the bloc's main gas grid. The proposal has yet to garner support among the bloc's 27 governments and must be unanimously backed to pass. LNG imports from Russia rose to record levels last year and accounted for more than 20% of the bloc's overall imports of the super chilled fuel. Fabian Zulig, chief executive of the European Policy Centre, said Russian economic actors are trying covertly to influence policymaking in the West to have limitations on their activities lifted. The EU should resist the temptation to re-engage economically with Russia, as Moscow will continue to be more than willing to weaponize interdependence in future. Simone Tagliapietra, senior fellow at Bruegel, said Europe was exposed to the risk of a divide and rule strategy by Moscow thanks to its lack of a unified approach to Russian gas imports, at a time when many across the continent might be tempted to resort to such gas supplies to lower energy prices. Well, in related news, Viktor Orban told state radio that Ukraine's move to halt Russian gas transit to Central Europe and the resulting rise in energy prices was unacceptable. This despite the fact Hungary's supply of Russian gas comes via the Turk Stream pipeline through Turkey, not via Ukraine. But Orban insists he maintains that the Ukraine route is important to Hungary. Orban also said that if gas flows did not restart, he would veto the next rollover of the sanctions the European Union has imposed on Russia over the war, which is due in around 6 months. It seems that there is no barrel too deep that Orban cannot still scrape it. Slovakia has arranged alternative gas supply, but Fico says it will have a problem refilling storage for next year's consumption and is losing money in transit fees. Fico also threatened to cut emergency electricity supplies to Ukraine, reduce aid for its refugees in Slovakia, or use its veto on EU decisions relating to Ukraine. Another fabulous Kremlin agent. But the EU is not beyond reproach. It has so far banned most imports of Russian coal and oil, but has repeatedly failed to restrict purchases of Moscow's LNG gas. And the EU will not attempt to fully ban Russian liquefied natural gas purchases in its latest sanctions package. The proposal will not include a blanket prohibition of LNG imports, as EU hawks have been urging. Instead, it would only stop Russian LNG from going to EU terminals not connected to the EU's gas system, a restriction that in reality won't affect most of the LNG imports. 10 EU countries, including Finland, Poland, and the Baltics, called on the European Commission to ban the import of Russian gas and LNG at the earliest possible date. Separate from LNG, the sanctions package will propose penalties on more aging oil exporting tankers operating as part of Russia's so-called shadow fleet, targeting 74 new vessels. Finally, the package will target video game equipment as well, like Microsoft's Xbox, that the EU says Russia is using to pilot drones. And finally, Turkey is launching a diplomatic effort to restart energy negotiations with the EU, eyeing the prospect of becoming a major supplier of natural gas after previous discussions were derailed by tensions with Cyprus. Turkish President Erdogan has had a long-standing ambition to turn his country into a regional hub for gas. The push comes as EU member countries like Hungary and Slovakia search for alternatives to Russian gas after the transit deal that allowed them to import supplies via Ukraine came to an end at the beginning of the year. We have the Southern Gas Corridor, said Kai Machi. We have 18 billion cubic meters of gas coming mainly from Azerbaijan, and we can easily expand this, connecting it to our Mediterranean gas. Our role is there, our potential is there. As well as transiting Azerbaijani gas and exporting its own domestic reserves, Turkey imports fuel from Russia via the Turk Stream pipeline under the Black Sea. And the Kremlin's agreement with Ukraine ended on January the 1st. The underwater link is the only remaining route for Moscow to ship supplies to Europe. But if one is being cynical, we could point out that perhaps Azerbaijan is simply making itself into a target for Russian aggression, moving up the list of targets for Russia's next war of occupation. So what is the conclusion from all this? That ending the war and indeed morality in geopolitics as it pertains to global energy supply is completely lacking. If countries aligned energy policies faster with their stated aims of forcing Russia to end its invasion of Ukraine, then it's likely the war would have ended much, much sooner and to the advantage of Ukraine. As it is, there is no end of Russia's aggression in sight and no clear desire to close the loopholes that continue to fuel the Russian economy and Putin's war machine. The hydrocarbon economy is not a force for good or morality in politics. Perhaps the green economy of the future will be more benign.